Hello everyone and welcome back to Mind Books for another interview with an author. My name's William, I'm the manager here, and it's great to have you joining with us again today. It is a pleasure to have with me today JohnWilliam Noble, a pastor and an author, and today we're going to be discussing his latest book, Biblical Marriage, Two Sinners and a Gracious God, which by the time you watch this will be available for sale here at Mind Books. I'm going to begin, if I may, JohnWilliam, by asking you just a few questions about who you are. If you can just tell us about yourself, who you are, what you're doing, and basically why you ended up writing a book.
So I'm JohnWilliam Noble. I'm a pastor in Scotland and I'm married to my wife Binglin. So she's originally from China and we met here in Edinburgh. And we have two children, a son called Amos who's 4 years old and a daughter Andian who is 20 months old. And we moved from Edinburgh to Aberdeen just over 2 years ago to begin a church plant. So it was literally a church plant from scratch. We were sent by Grace Baptist Church Edinburgh to begin Grace Baptist Church Aberdeen. And in the past couple of years we've seen some steady growth of the church in terms of people who've been added into membership and also just some of our evangelistic outreach into the area. Obviously that has been hampered somewhat with the COVID restrictions, but the Lord has been gracious in that. In that time, I've also become the director of a Christian school which is being established in Aberdeen called Melville Knox Christian School Aberdeen, and I'm also a member of the Board of Reformed Christian Education in Scotland. So we look not only to have a Christian school established in Aberdeen, but we hope and pray in other parts of the country too. And in addition to that, I'm also the director and co-founder of a publisher in Scotland called Parousia. And I've written a couple of books, the latest one being this one here.
Perfect, thank you very much. And the book is clearly biblical marriage, but out of all the biblical topics you could have discussed, why marriage? Why write a book about this?
So a number of years ago, my wife was asked the question, how often do you and your husband argue? And when my wife, who's called Binglin, told me this, I reflected on the premise of the question, which I realised was, well, if you're arguing a lot, that's a barometer that your marriage has difficulties. If you're not arguing a lot, then that means your marriage is okay. And it also got me thinking about something I'd witnessed not long before that. I was sitting in a restaurant and I saw a couple and they were eating food together. This was obviously maybe a night out. And I literally didn't see them speak two words to each other until maybe towards the end of the evening. And it was, I felt quite sad because they were clearly a couple, whether they were married or not, they were in a relationship together. And it got me thinking about a couple of key issues in terms of relationships, especially in the context of marriage, namely trust and communication. And I began writing a blog article on the topic of trust, and this was based on these thoughts and the discussions I'd had with my wife, in addition to the many ways in which, because of me being a sinner, my wife can't trust me, and how then can she trust me, and kind of unpacking that point. But because this blog article was going into the many thousands of words, I realised that, well, people won't read this as a blog article, and then some other things kind of came up as I was studying and writing, and it became more of a fleshed out work to become a book.
So why then, is there a specific reason why you thought it was necessary to write another book on Christian marriage? I mean, we're in a bookshop here and I know several books that are even on these shelves. So why did you find it necessary to write another one?
Yes, I guess there's many things I could say about that. Maybe I'll cover three aspects. So the first one obviously is the premise of the book. So it's titled Biblical Marriage, but it's got this kind of subheading, Two Sinners and a Gracious God. So there are some excellent resources and books on the topic of marriage, but as I'm sure many people would be aware, there are many books on marriage which are unhelpful and often unbiblical, though they claim to be. So I think I was very keen to stress not just the biblical premise of marriage using passages like Genesis 2 and Ephesians 5, but also to really hit home some expectations, some false expectations that people may have of marriage and the happily ever after dream aspect of it. I mean, marriage is a greater blessing than even the Hollywood dream may portray in any film or narrative. But it's important to understand the premise that as two people coming together, a husband and a wife, we're two sinners and we are going to let each other down, we are going to annoy, irritate, and so on and so forth. So unpacking the man's sinful and fallen condition and how we then relate to one another and the restoration we have in Christ, that redemption where we see Christ coming for his bride, and what then a marriage relationship looks like as a metaphor of that, was something I really wanted to draw out on a theological and even practical level. But then people may then wonder, well, you're obviously a young guy, why would you be writing on marriage? So this takes me to a couple of other things that makes this book maybe unique, whether that would be good or bad. The first one is, I would argue on some levels, because I'm younger and because of the premise of this book being two sinners and a gracious God, this is actually me writing not from the perspective of, well, I've got decades of experience, so here is what I have learned, but rather here is what I am learning, and also here is what the Bible is teaching. And I think there is some kind of helpful aspects to that. Certainly some people who read my book, even somebody who wrote a review, identified that this was actually a strength of the book, which I think if people want to kind of consider and see that more, then maybe that's a reason to read it. And another aspect of it is that my wife is from China and I'm from Scotland. So even before we were married, on the topic of arguing, we argued probably comparably more than many couples as they were beginning to get to know each other. And one of the overriding reasons was because we realised how little we knew of each other's cultures and how much we were influenced, not so much by biblical thinking in areas, but by maybe what it means to do this in a Scottish way or what it means to do this in a Chinese way. And it really made us all the more intentional about working and thinking about what it means to be biblical in our relationship with one another. And not just from a cross-cultural perspective, but just from having worked through that. That's obviously something that is drawn out in the book, and it's where I give a number of practical points. Yeah.
So, who have you intended the book to be read by then? I mean, I just got married recently myself, so is it for people who've just been married? Is it people who...
Yeah, I would say you'd be a kind of great example. I mean, I think one thing that needs to be stressed, obviously on a practical level, people who are thinking about getting married, people who've just got married, even people who've been married for a while, naturally you can imagine, well, a book on marriage is going to be helpful. But one other thing we do need to realise is that marriage has been instituted by the Lord. There's a theological depth to this that has a practical outworking that's more relevant to some than others, but it is something that every born-again believer should be thinking and praying about on, I would argue, a number of levels. And therefore I would make the argument that this isn't a topic where people who are not married, or maybe they've been married many years, say, well, it's got nothing to do with me, because obviously when we think about how we can still be prayerfully and practically supporting married couples, but also how we can understand the truth of this in the scriptures, that's certainly a blessing for every believer.
Okay. So, anyway, it's pretty obvious the book's about marriage, biblical marriage, but can you tell us about some of the key themes within that subject of marriage that you discussed in the book then?
So I'll just cover a few, because I could spend quite a long time on this. So as well as trust, communication, that aspect, a few other points that are covered in the book. One is on the topic of blame. So I kind of based this chapter around an argument that Bingman and I had many years ago over something trivial. It was, we'd had different ideas about what we would do on my day off. And it led to an argument, and it led to some immature reactions, and we didn't speak to each other for a while. And so what that chapter does is diagnose biblically, well, where was it that I as the husband, where was it that Bingman as the wife have gone wrong in relating to each other, and then considering from a passage in Genesis where when Adam and Eve have sinned and they've fallen, they're quick to blame other people. So we see Adam blaming the woman and Eve blaming the serpent, and just unpacking that point. So that's kind of one key theme. Some others that would be more expected, but it's still crucially important to kind of work through this. One is on the topic of sexual purity, and then another chapter on lust. We're living in a culture where these are things that do impact our society, even where Christians would be concerned in terms of maybe what they're watching and their understanding of this. And I think there can be a tendency sometimes to have the posture of, well, I won't speak about this. But it's important to understand that sexual purity, for example, isn't something that is to be not spoken of, but it's actually something to be adorned. It's a doctrine, a reality that we can rejoice in as a blessing from the Lord. So unpacking that is important to then understand why issues such as lust is obviously going to be a major difficulty, and that's unpacked in the book. A couple of other brief ones. We'll look at the topic of finances, and this has got some, obviously, some practical teeth to it for people who maybe have financial difficulties, but it's not just about that. It's also about understanding, well, as husband and wife, as one flesh, what should your attitude be towards your possessions and to your finances, not having well, this is mine and this is your mindset, and kind of working through that from that biblical foundation is quite important. And one other one I'll mention is just on the topic of parenting, and we kind of look at a number of points in that. It's the longest chapter in the book, and again, for me right now, being the father of 2 young children, as well as establishing some theological basis for this from the scriptures, then looking at some practical areas, especially from Ephesians 6:4 on bringing up your children in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. These are things that are drawn out in quite a bit of depth.
Okay. So, I speak from experience now that marriage itself is very much a joyous thing to live through, but writing about marriage may not be as joyous. So did you find it a challenge to write this book, or did you find it something that was easy, or...?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess on one level it is a joy, because this is something that the Lord's instituted, and I certainly love to study the scriptures and to write about it. I think in terms of the topic of marriage, it's immensely humbling, because if it isn't clear already, I'm not writing in the context of, well, I'm an expert in marriage on any practical level. I'm coming as a sinner who is in desperate need of the Lord's grace, and this is something that I reflected on through the process, because some of the things I was writing about, I was realizing even at that point and even now, how utterly dependent I am upon the Lord. So on that level, it is a joy to realize that Christ is the head of our marriage, but it is humbling when I realize what an inadequate husband I would be but for that. And also on a more practical level of book writing just generally, I would say it's a joy and it is a challenge, but the kind of key point when you're putting together something of greater depth and length is it is a discipline. I'm a pastor, I write sermons, and that's a discipline in and of itself, of course. And then when you come to the prospect of writing a book, you're obviously dealing with a different kind of, if you use the term audience, in terms of people are actually opening up and reading something, and obviously due to the length and thinking about how you construct arguments, that does take much time and prayer. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just for one final question, this interview's gone very quickly, but we're glad that we had you here. Just as a concluding question, to many people viewing this, you would be a relatively new author, but today you're not only here as a new author, you're also representing a new publishing company. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that, and perhaps some of the exciting titles that we can expect from you over the next few weeks and months.
So when I was actually working through this book, a friend of mine who's also a pastor in Glasgow, so he's called Daniel Funke, he had worked for the Banner of Truth, and he'd done quite a bit of typesetting and other work with that publisher, and he offered to typeset the book. And this was before we'd secured a publisher, and this ended up being published by an American publisher called Whitfenstock. But during the process of Daniel typesetting the book and just doing a bit of work through it, we began to talk about what it would take to establish a publisher in and of ourselves, if you like. And especially with some of Daniel's skill sets, it seemed like there would be scope for that. But the thing that really attracted me to the possibility of exploring this was that he had had an idea to release a new edition of the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith with the scripture proofs. And I was stunned to hear that there wasn't any modern day edition of that had been released. And so when I realized that there would be a market for that, I was very keen to pursue at least inquiring of interest. So what Daniel and I did was we came up with the idea that we would possibly aim to establish a publishing house, and we came up with this name Parousia, which in the Greek is the word for boldness. It's found in a few different places in the New Testament. But we wanted to gauge the interest, as I mentioned, so we launched this project on a platform called Kickstarter, and we aimed to raise at least £3,000 within 50 days. And we managed to raise over that within a day and a half of launching it. So we realised, well, we've got a market, and this was something that was advertised by mainly Reformed Baptists, but by Christians all around the world. We had backers from all the different continents in the world, and it was really quite exciting to see. So this obviously gave us the momentum to go forward. So a number of months later, we're just about at the end of finalising the typesetting and the proofreading and all the other bits and pieces that are required for the release of the confession, and 3 other accompanying doctrine paperbacks, one by Benjamin Keach, one by Hercules Collins. Maybe a lot of people might not have heard of these guys unless they're in Reformed Baptist circles, but certainly it's some rich doctrine, and 2 of the books are catechisms. And on the topic of parenting, I would very much say that catechizing your children, as well as for us as adults, is quite an important thing to do. Where, just to explain, if anyone doesn't know what that means, to catechize means there's a question, a theological question, then an answer. So it's a book filled with questions from the Bible with answers. So those are the initial releases that are coming up, and we're hoping to have these also available on an online shop as well as in bookshops. And then going forward, we do have some other ideas for some historical works and maybe even some contemporary works. But yeah, we've got quite a good platform for this, and we've already got a kind of target audience, a kind of group of people following it and supporting it, which has been great.
Well, thank you very much. We look forward to hopefully having you back to discuss some more of these titles in the near future then. Yeah, great. But for the time being, thank you very much, John William, for joining us this afternoon. Well, thank you very much for joining and watching this exclusive interview with JohnWilliam Noble on his latest book, Biblical Marriage. This book is now available from our website, moundedbooks.com. The recommended retail price is £13, but we have it on there for £9.50. As usual with all our books ordered online, postage and packaging is free. We do have plenty in stock available to order right away, so please go ahead and order one and we'll get sent out to you straight away. But thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you soon for some more interviews.